Australia with an upside down warning, caution Australia. For those who aren't familiar with Australia, some lovely places to get to, but we do have some welcoming critters, some of the most venomous snakes and spiders in the world. You want to stay away from our box jellyfish, blue ring octopus, crocodiles, etc. But apart from that, please feel welcome. Not only have we got some interesting critters, we've got some remote places, and that's one of the tracks I've been on, and that's not a misprint. 1,900 kilometres, that's about 1,100 miles between petrol stations is the way it used to be. Now you only have to go halfway before you can pull into an Aboriginal community and get fuel. So you've only got to be able to carry enough fuel for 1,000 kilometres. Yeah, it's interesting. And there's where I'm about to leave the sealed road and get onto a dirt road. Had a lot of fun, but there's been people who don't heed the warnings and get into trouble. Just as at half an hour ago, I got news, there's a little kid lost in the bush, and it's cold, and the remoteness can be serious. Why am I talking about warnings? Well, Aussie Outback can be a lot of fun if you heed the warnings. Data Vault can be a huge productivity gain if you heed some warnings. I'd suggest there's probably two major warnings. One is I've seen people try to develop their own tools and get into trouble. That's probably a topic for another night. And if I say night, it's late in Australia here at the moment. Yeah, we've probably got some tool vendors on board, and let me be absolutely clear, I am so appreciative of the investment that people have made in giving us tools. But the warning is that tools are essential but not sufficient. Here's some statements from Dan Lindstead's blog from 4 years ago. In summary, the Data Vault has to be about the business, not technology. If you build a source system Data Vault, and by that we mean a system that reflects the thinking of the operational systems you've got rather than reflecting the business view, you may strike trouble. And the solution, Dan says, is you've got to focus on ontologies, which is great, but we hear your warnings, Dan, but what on earth is an ontology? If I have one, if I don't have one, can I build one? And once I've got one, importantly, how do I apply it to get Data Vault success? So the main agenda for tonight is looking at how do we get one of these top-down models that Dan suggests is so important. Once we've got it, designing a Data Vault, then mapping source systems, and finally closing the gap. I'll just comment at this point, I do understand when tool vendors demonstrate the power of their tools, they may jump straight to point 3, point the tool at a source system and say, look at how our beautiful system, you hit what I call the big green go button, and you automatically generate a Data Vault. Full marks for the tool vendors for the power of the tool, but what I'm suggesting, and I'll be interested in your feedback please, is that a little bit of preparation to focus on the business can save you from a lot of pain. So that's the agenda. Let's go. The focus is going to be more on the first 2 points. You're probably pretty familiar with 3 and 4. We'll touch on them lightly. Okay, building a top-down model instead of bottom-up. Neil, in the UK you have white swans, Australia has black swans, and there's a black swan doing some bottom-up data modelling. Well, bottom-up feeding. Okay, what's an enterprise ontology? The second definition there is it talks about um, concepts, properties, and relations. I'm going to flip that around to probably terms that data modelers think of. Business concepts will appear in a conceptual data model as entities. Properties will be their attributes, and relations is the relationships between those entities. So please, I'm encouraging you, don't be frightened of the term ontology if you're not familiar with it. Think of it as an enterprise data model, a conceptual data model, a business information model. And I know data modelers can have great debates on the distinctions between some of those terms. But for us, we want a framework that reflects business concepts, their major attributes, and their interrelationships. And we've got an ontology that can then be used to help us shape a data vault design. So Australia has a number of cities that just grew. Our capital city was designed, and I am sure the people who did the town planning didn't worry about the details of taps. They were interested in water stores, utilities, etc. In many areas of life, we start with a big picture that is not sufficient, but it gives us an overall perspective. If you're designing a car, you'll put a clay model together, you'll put it in a wind tunnel and so on. One of the key things, I'm going to take a car as an example. If I'm designing a car, and seriously, if I was, you probably wouldn't want to buy it. But the designers know there are patterns for gearboxes, differentials, clutches, universals. These components exist in the data modeling world. We also have patterns so that we can assemble components and get a framework built quite fast. Two major authors of data model patterns, David Hay, Len Silverstone. I have huge admiration for both. Why have I got the cake and water? I remember clearly when instant cakes just add water first came out, my mother, bless her, said, John, you can have good or you can have fast. If you want good, it's fresh milk, fresh eggs, fresh butter, or you can have this instant rubbish. David Hay and others say that by use of proven flexible patterns, you can have good and fast. So what does a data model pattern look like? Some of you may have come across the party or party role pattern. Some will love it, some will hate it. I'm not here to take a particular position or debate on that. But here's an example of a pattern. It's saying that a party can be a person or an organisation. Think of it as an address book, and in the address book, there's physical addresses, postal addresses, electronic addresses, the name or names of people and organisations, interrelationships between them. That's just a quick, high-level introduction to just one pattern. Here's how we can use it with the business. I often run workshops and deliberately seek the participation of IT professionals and the business. Now, the IT professionals in the white at the top there is a subset of the party and party role pattern. I did some work with Australia's Health Practitioner Regulation Agency. Basically, somebody can't just claim to be a dentist and start practicing, and I would hope in your country too, the same would be true. But I spoke with the business and I said, okay, what sorts of people and what sorts of roles? And they said, well, we've got health practitioners, and examples of them are doctors, dentists, and so on. We've got nursing practitioners, but then they specialise as nurses or midwives, etc. We also have registered training organisations, people who lodge complaints, our own employees, and the patients, the care recipients. The important thing is the business can structure this sort of view themselves with a little bit of guidance. I'll tell you a story. I'll just show you the next slide first. Here is 9 of the common patterns I use. And by the way, at the end of this presentation, I've got some links to some free resources. David and Len's publications alone account for 2,000 pages of heavy reading on data model patterns. I'm going to point you at a free resource I've assembled, which gives you a sufficient taste of these patterns. Strongly recommend their books, but an introduction for free. So we've looked at party and role. Location, think of Google Maps, positions on the place of the earth, agreements, contracts, documentary evidence of them. Tasks and events are interesting. Tasks, think of a workflow management system where you do a job. When it's finished, what's the next job in the queue? Events typically trigger work. Somebody taking the medical practitioner's example I just gave, somebody lodges a complaint. There's a whole sequence of tasks that follow. At the end of the tasks, a decision will be made, and that decision is an event itself. So there's a symbiotic relationship there. Resources and assets, products, they're the 9 most common patterns. If we look at an example of it from conveyancing, Neil, if I say I would like to buy your land, I'm the purchaser, you're the vendor. We have an agreement for a price. Hopefully there will be documentary evidence, not just a handshake, because if there isn't documentary evidence, we may have a dispute whether I offered 10 million, Neil, for your home or not. That is a joke. This is being filmed, so there is documentary evidence if I had made a serious offer. So this is buying and selling of land. You have agreements that relate to assets that are at a location. Now we'll take another example in Australia, and I think some of the participants here are perhaps from the United States. The US also has wildfires, Greece does, a number of countries. So we've got the same fundamental patterns, but in this case, for example, the parties and roles is Australia may enter into an agreement, a lease agreement, with an aircraft supplier in the United States. So for a few months of our summer, we will hire helicopters, water bombers, etc., to help us fight fires. Resources and assets, in this particular case, bulldozers, graders, pumps, generators, etc. Won't go through the whole thing, but I'm just saying with the same patterns, we've got 2, I'm going to go back 1 slide, buying and selling of land, responding to wildfires. The example I gave about the health practitioner organisation, a real smile on my face. I was getting a cup of coffee the working day after we'd run a workshop with the C-level executives of this organisation. And we're talking about data model patterns and coming up with an enterprise data model. But what I am suggesting is that if you introduce them to these patterns in a non-threatening way, they get ownership. What made me smile in the kitchen was when I heard a C-level executive boasting to a fellow executive about the enterprise data model he had developed the day before. He had ownership. There's a pattern of patterns, there's the 9 pillars, but the relationships such as between party and role and agreement, a party in a role participates in or is a signatory to an agreement. So there's patterns across all of these. Where is all of this leading us? Is that can we deliver good and fast? I'll tell some stories. Got a phone call from the IT manager, the CIO of a large not-for-profit in Australia. He said, John, I understand you're being pretty busy with your current client, but you're about to take 3 weeks annual leave. What I want you to do is to sacrifice your annual leave, come and work for us, and I want you to prepare an enterprise data model in 3 weeks, which we did using patterns. And it had a radical impact on that organisation, the insight that it gained. Telecommunications, I had worked with a gentleman from a large Australian telco. He'd moved to another one. And he said, John, remember we had a whole team that put 5 person years into coming up with an enterprise data model and didn't finish. He said, I want you to do the same on your own and you've got 2 weeks. Can you do it? I said, well, I can do it better than that. I can lend you my book by Len Silverstone, and there's a chapter on the telecommunications data model, and you're going to have it for free. He did engage me for 2 weeks. A bank, I'm assuming most of the people on this call are data professionals. This particular bank had a business process re-engineering initiative, and they got partway through and said, blast, we've actually got a data problem. It's not a process problem. Got a phone call, John, are you available? Can you help come up with an enterprise-wide data model with a drill down into this problem area? I said, well, I can give you a day or 2 for the next few weeks. And Dave laughed and he said, that's more than enough. You start on Tuesday lunchtime, you'll be finished by Wednesday. You've got 1 day to do an enterprise data model. We gave it our best shot. We delivered sufficient to get them going. So what I'm saying is these patterns really can deliver quality at speed. It assumes you've got a familiarity with the patterns, but I am a great advocate of patterns. That's good. Let's have a look at a summary here of what that means. How do I develop an enterprise ontology? I start with the patterns, talk to the business, etc. I often in days form a schematic, a pretty picture that the business gets that shows how their organisation works. From it, we do a drill down. You remember the example where I said party and role. You've got medical practitioners, which include nurses, doctors, chiropractors. So the business comes up with what some people might call a taxonomy. You might prefer supertype, subtypes. If you're from an OO environment, superclass, subclass, it's a taxonomy. When you have these entities and their attributes, and in blue, you show the interrelationships between them, that's an ontology. Dan Linstead says, start with a business ontology to shape your Data Vault initiative. I've been talking about enterprise ontologies, enterprise data models for non-Data Vault initiatives. Now I want to bring it around to Data Vault. The health practitioner organisation I worked with, I was actually engaged to help them set up an IT strategy, and as a result of the strategy, way down in the project, they said, we actually want a data vault as part of the solution architecture. Far more recently, I walked into a new consultancy with a cemetery. Their business, burials and cremations. I'm not trying to be crude. It's a fairly simple business model. Another consultant had already done the enterprise-wide data model. I joined. Very, very interesting. They had a 13-week delivery time frame for the vendor they engaged after they'd done their strategy, but the first week of the job was to do a solution architecture, and in week 1 of 13 they said, let's have a data vault. There were some people that would prefer an Inmon 3 and F type data warehouse. Others preferred Kimball, sorry, the name escapes me. Your dimensional database. Sorry for that. But a data vault was chosen. But in those two examples, although the enterprise data model shaped the data vault, the initiative didn't start with the assumption of a data vault. Now I'll talk about something that's perhaps a little bit sensitive. I won't name the organisation, but they had predetermined they wanted a data vault. I suggested that in line with Dan's thinking on shaping the data vault model by a business perspective, we really should invest in an enterprise ontology, a business information model if you prefer. The gentleman said, I've seen that take 2 years. We don't have the time. John, I am not giving you permission to do one of these ontology things. You're not having the time. I want you to deliver a data vault model, have a look at the source systems, work out their data. And I spoke to this gentleman, I said, that's heading dangerously close to a source system data vault, which is against Dan's advice. And he said, well, I'm not giving you 2 years. And I said, I don't want 2 years. Can I have 2 days with your best and brightest? And I believe we'll come up with sufficient. He laughed and he said, you're asking for 2 days, I'll give you 2 weeks. So that perhaps gives a few real life case studies where the thinking of the business has helped shape the data vault design, which takes me to the next thing. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to point you to materials so you too can grab published data model patterns and come up with a business view. Step 1. Step 2 is I've got one of these things. How on earth do I apply it to a data vault design? We've spoken about source system data vault. How not to design hubs is to go to your source system, find a table and assume that that table represents a business concept and is automatically a strong candidate for being a hub. Now, I said I've got admiration and appreciation of the tool vendors. Sometimes the companies who acquire tools or engage consultancies actually put pressure on these good people to say, I want you to just load data in, get it in. You're telling me the tools can do it fast, and they will push for a source system data vault. So how should we do it? I've spoken a little bit about Dan Lenstead. I'm sure many of you know Hans Holtgren. In one of his books, he talks about, I'm putting it, I think in my words, finding the sweet spot. He says, taking the emergency response to fires as an example, you'll hear people occasionally talk of highly generalized concepts such as assets, or maybe more specialized concepts such as assets that are vehicles. Vehicles can be aircraft or land vehicles. Aircraft can be fixed wing planes, helicopters, and you can have forward-looking infrared planes. Listen to the business and you will find them typically just in their day-to-day conversations, focusing on somewhere on the extreme generalization to specialization continuum. Listen to the business, and that is a really good starting spot, a candidate to have, in this case, a hub called aircraft rather than a hub called asset. Too generalized. A hub called forward-looking infrared plane, too specialized. So here's an example from some work I did in the 1990s before I knew of Data Vault, but nonetheless an enterprise ontology. And again, going back to Dan, he talks about semantics and grain, and people sometimes say, what on earth is semantics and grain? Trying to simplify it, but people, if I have a hierarchy, supertypes to subtypes, assets, vehicles, etc., I can put a circle around things that look like good candidates for hubs, and I can have a hub aircraft, hub watercraft, fire truck and dozer. That's generalisation of assets. I've got events, emergency events, planned events, wildfires, floods, and wildfires are grass or forest fires. These are just examples. If we're going to go with Dan's guideline that a hub should be around one common semantics and one grain, what does it mean? All of these entities, asset, vehicle, aircraft, should have a description of exactly what an aircraft is, that we probably all understand that one. That's the semantics. Grain is simply, for hubs, links is a different thing for grain. For hubs is in this supertype, subtype hierarchy, what's the position we're taking? That's my suggestion for simplifying this concept of finding a common semantics and grain as the basis for the hubs. What if we get it wrong? What if we say we'll have river floods, a hub for river floods and a hub for tsunamis, and later we say, blast, I actually want to lift the hub up to a higher level of generalisation. What do? Pretty simple. I create a new flood hub. I remap the feeds that used to go to the river flood and tsunami, and I map them to the flood hub. I leave in my data vault the history for those two old hubs. I leave it alone, and I add some business rules to consolidate the two old hubs with the new hubs. Insert only, nothing changes other than I now can present at a higher level of grain. Similarly, wildfire was too high, I want to split it up, create the two new detailed hubs, remap the feeds to them, leave the history for the wildfire alone, and use business rules to deconstruct. So it's good to make no mistakes and get it right first time. Data Vault is flexible and forgivable, and I'm suggesting that even if you get this fairly fundamental decision, I'll say wrong, it's not the end of the world. So we've spoken about using the ontology for hubs. We also want to look at links. So here's an ontology. There's a couple of hubs, a loan hub and a financial institute hub. There's a relationship between them in the ontology that links a loan to the bank. There's a link, and I can grab some attributes for a conform satellite. Now you might scratch your heads a little bit and say, John, a conform satellite? Isn't a conform satellite the careful assembly of satellites from multiple sources and pulling it together so we have one consistent business view? At the risk of being a little bit controversial, what I'm suggesting is if you start with a business perspective, before you even look at the source systems, you can listen to the business and say the sort of data we want to consume in our data mart is data about loan type, loan amount, balance owing, interest rate, and variable rate adjustment. Got no idea where I'm going to get it from, but you can capture the major attributes that the business is saying they want presented to them before you even look at the source systems. Now, making it black and white, in practice, it's a bit more iterative, but just sharing a perspective of the top down. So we find the hubs, we find the sweet spot on the supertype, subtype hierarchy. We've got the hubs, we've got a relationship, there's the loan, and we assemble some a data vault satellite to reflect business attributes. Okay, we've now got a skeleton. We've got hubs, links, and some satellites. Now let's look at the source system, which is where some people start for tools. And you've probably seen the tool demos. Yeah, as I say, these wonderful tools, they are great tools, and if I've got some tool vendors on board, please, I am not criticising your tool. I'm just saying they are so powerful that people can be tempted to use them to populate a data vault without starting with the business. Anyhow, we've got our high-level business-centric hubs, links, and satellites. Now, in this simple example, way too simple, we pick up a source feed from the loan management system. First thing we do is we say, looks like some business keys, a loan number and a customer number. I think I can map those attributes to the hubs. Then I can look at sets of business keys and say, oh, the combination of loan number and customer number, that is the same as the business keys related for this business link. And there's some attributes here from the source system that I can map to a source-driven satellite. We've still got the conform satellite that reflects the business, but now probably most of you would be aware that against one hub you may have many satellites, and as a generalization you'll have one satellite per source system feed. So if you've got 5 source systems feeding information about loans, you may have 5 source specific satellites. So that's simple mapping. We have already had the skeleton. We've looked for the first time at an actual source, mapped it. Life is simple, job done. Life isn't usually that simple. Neil, going back to me buying your house for $10 million, when people buy and sell houses, there's a day where the settlement occurs, and you have solicitors from both sides and banks from both sides, and basically money is handed over and the rights to the purchase property is handed to the other party. That's settled and finished. So if I have a settlement transaction and I start by looking at the business keys, I think, oh gee, I've got a loan, I've got a vendor, the person selling, and I've got the solicitor or conveyancer, and I've got their bank, and I've got the purchaser, many business keys that relate to hubs. But I want to actually first just capture this data. Now, I realise what I'm about to say may be considered controversial. Here I'm mapping a link as a non-historized link. It is just a transaction, and in this model, the link has a satellite. Now, there are respected practitioners who like having, at least allowing satellites on links. There are others who have different approaches. Rather than get into a great debate right now on this, I'm going to suggest that both approaches can be made to work for the sake of communication. I'm just taking the option for a link to have a satellite, and if you prefer to do it differently, I will respect that. So we can say, here's a source system, let's create a transactional link with a satellite, and then we'll work out what we'll do with it. The working out says, I've got some business keys, they can map to the hubs, and then we're going to need some business rules to say, okay, I understand the hubs that form the set of business keys in this link. What about the other attributes? So I can say, I can map the links raw satellites attributes to a hub, and I can say amongst, I don't know, was it 10 or a large number of business keys, I can say one of the sets of business keys in this horrible complex thing is a pair of business keys that logically maps to a link. I can write some business rules. I've actually persisted, I've stored this settlement link with its satellite. That's raw vault. Then I add some business rules to move data selectively into the hubs, links and satellites that are more reflective of the business. So pulling it all together, just having a look at the time, Neil. Okay, my wife and I were down on the Australian coast one time, and you'll see in the middle left on what appears a fairly sheer rock face, there's actually a little ledge. And an Australian fur seal, we watched him for quite a few minutes as he, step by step, worked his way up this cliff face, and he actually got over to that ledge, lay back, relaxed, and enjoyed the sun. And I'm thinking, gee, it looked difficult, but if you tackle these tasks one at a time, you can get there. And I'm suggesting that building an enterprise ontology sounds hard. Using it to shape your data vault model may sound challenging. I don't want to be seen as plugging my book because quite frankly, as an author, the profit I get from each book sale will not buy me one cup of coffee, but in it I do have some step-by-step guides. There are also some other free resources on TDAN that will help you break down the individual steps in doing a business-centric data vault. Okay, I'm going to tell a sad story. Some of you may have been at sites where there is more than one consultancy, and sometimes the consultancies work together well and respectively. Sometimes they compete for turf. Not the way it should be. So this organisation said, we actually have about 50 operational systems that hold customer data. We can shake our heads and be amazed. That is the actual number they suggested of source systems that held customer data. The business said, we want one customer hub. And yes, there may be 50 satellites hanging off it, but we can do a conformed satellite with some business rules. Let's start with one customer hub. And that was design number one. And a consultancy said, yep, we can do that, not a problem. Consultancy number two comes along and says, that's the end goal, but let us show you how quickly we can load source system data vault stuff. And we don't even have to stop and think about passive integration and overlapping key values. We will propose we have 50 customer hubs, each with one satellite, and then later, at some stage in the future, we will create a business vault customer hub, which is the consolidation of all of those hubs with its conformed satellite. And I can still remember the actual words of one of the consultants. He said, I don't see what the problem is if we have 50 customer hubs. Believe me, the business person who was in the room at the time did see a problem, and his response was a little colourful, let's put it that way. And the business was basically saying, so you want to load all this data in, and at some stage in the future, eventually, we'll pull it all together and have consolidation. That's where we want to start. His concern was that there was no thinking up front about how that consolidation would occur. That was seen by this consultancy as somebody else's problem. So design number two had a short lifespan. Design number three, the same consultancy said, look, you want us to do some consolidation. You've got multiple projects that want to work off an enterprise customer hub. it is too hard, it's going to take too much time. Let's say, as a bit of a compromise, we actually have a consolidated hub for customer in project 1 and a consolidated hub in project 2 and a consolidated hub in project 3, and we will deliver that consolidation a bit quicker than if we tried to get enterprise-wide consolidation. But at least we've got a bit of consolidation on each project, and then somebody else later can take one hub from each project and do the final consolidation. And the business said, you're not listening to us. Your end game is where we want to start. This is a real case study, people. It was a little bit sad. There was a little bit of tension. Along comes another consultancy. And I thought, breath of fresh air. They said, no, we want each project just to have one customer hub. And they started to look at the data and they said, and you're probably familiar with passive integration, the simple example is if I have customer 1, 2, 3 in one system and customer 1, 2, 3 in another, and 1, 2, 3 in both systems means Neil Strange. I'm picking on you a bit tonight, Neil. Then we can load 2 satellites, one from each source system, to a single instance of the customer hub. So this consultancy said, yeah, we'll have one customer hub with passive integration. Then they looked a little bit further and said, okay, those systems with passive integration have integer business keys, but hang on, here is a customer hub that has alphanumeric business keys. They won't fit. We want to define a business key that is integer. This is a different data structure. Oh, okay, we've got 2 hubs. We'll have a customer hub for the alphanumeric, but at least they're not overlapping. Integers and alphanumeric are never going to clash. So we can have another hub with non-overlapping business keys. Then they came across another source that said, we've got integers, but 1, 2, 3 might mean Neil in systems, in 2 of the systems, but 1, 2, 3 means John Giles in our system. The same value means a different real world person. So this consultancy said, oh, blast, we're going to have 3 hubs. The one with passive integration, the one with alphanumeric, and the one with integer, but meaning something different. Then they found a customer hub. I know this story is dragging on a bit, but they found another source that said the business key is actually made up of 2 components. Oh, we're going to have a 2-part customer hub, and then a 3-part, and then a 4-part. And it got worse because they found that some of the systems that had 2-part customer keys meant something different. A and B for them was different to the 2 parts in another, and the number of hubs just grew and grew. The business wasn't happy. So they forced some of the consultancies to say, okay, each project will have just one customer hub. We will not allow the technology issues of integer and string and overlapping and non-overlapping and multi-part keys. We won't let that stop us having one customer hub, and we'll do it per project, which was a heck of a lot closer. But the sad thing, it was basically back to the original design, number 1, just on a project by project basis. Could it have been done differently? Going back, and this is hypothetical, but is a nice simple example for emergency response in the state in Australia I live in for fires, floods, etc. Let's assume that there's a HR system where Alex, Brooke, Chris and Dan have employee numbers 1, 2, 3 and 4. There's also a payroll system. Brooke and Dan aren't on the payroll system. Maybe they're paid by some other arrangement, but this is passive integration. Employee number 3 means the same in both systems, passive integration. The employees can also be identified by the building access swipe card proximity device that they have. there are contractors and they are recorded in a contract management system, but contractor number one is not employee number one. And then I've got an example of a multi-part business key where we have a volunteer fire response agency, and they use state, district, brigade and member number to identify their firefighters. It's a 4-part key. How on earth do we get it together? Again, in my book, there's a lot on this, but the slide set's available. I will give you a quick introduction. If we have a hub that allows 2 components to a business key, one is the key source. Did I get this employee number from the contract management system, the card access, building access system, the HR system? So the first column, which will be hashed, will be part of the hashing algorithm, identifies the key source. What system that provides business keys supplied this, and then what is the business value? And you'll notice the last 4 entries in the pink there have a concatenation using a pipe symbol, and we can put all of the employees in one hub where we can have same as links, which I've got in red, where we can say that contractor 2 is the same as employee number 4. We can do same as links. We can have business rules that generate same as links based on rules. We can have all of the satellites together. So it's based on the principle that
No, but
if it's the same grain.
Bluetooth is off.
Hello? I've got somebody chatting. I think I'll keep going. We've got some questions at the end. So it's based on the principle, if the business says that employees across all these source systems mean the same, have the same grain, the business wants one hub, the techos don't want it because of problems with the keys, can we achieve peace? The answer is yes. We don't. Firstly, a warning, in some publications you will hear people talk of a thing with multiple business keys when they mean one business key with multiple parts. Just be careful when you read. We can concatenate them. One of the objections to this approach, and I'm just saying it's one possible solution, one of the objections is people might want to sort or filter by components of a multi-part business key. And there are many ways of doing it. One, which, boy, this is controversial, and I'm just saying it's one way, is you can hold the components of the business key as attributes in a satellite. Happy to take questions on that. There are other ways of doing it, but just saying, if the business says all these sources supply employees and they've got different key structures, the business wants it together, they have the same grain of semantics, put it together. Now, the difference between a key with multiple elements versus a thing with actually different business keys, that's a picture of my almost faithful Land Rover broken down in the desert. A mine worker found me, quite a story, rescued me, had a good chat with this delightful rescuer. He said that his particular vehicle, he used to wear engines out, but the bodies lasted forever in the dry desert air. In contrast, the mine was an underground mine with salt and moisture in the ground, and the bodies lasted sometimes as little as 6 months. But the engines were perfectly good. So what do they do? When a surface vehicle wore out its engine and a mine vehicle rusted out its body, they just combined good bodies and good parts. So here's the question. If we said we've got a thing called a vehicle, what is the business key for a vehicle? And we can't always say registration number because on this massive mine site, many of the vehicles were not registered. They never left the mine site. So yeah, the vehicle identification number on the body is one candidate. The engine number is another candidate, but they get mixed and matched. Long story short, I encountered a similar problem with another client. The solution we agreed on was we would have a hub, in this particular case for the car body, a hub for the engine. We would have a link with an effectivity satellite that says, when did that body and that engine get matched? We've got a timestamp against it, and in Business Vault, we can create this view of a vehicle. So that's just a little thing on, if you encounter multiple business keys for what seems to be the same thing, consider having a hub for each element. So in summary, the steps to the task for success: task 1, define the enterprise ontology, collect the source information, talk to your subject matter experts, find out what glossaries you've got, etc., and create an enterprise ontology. From that, task 2, start with a top-down view of business-centric hubs, business-centric links, and you may choose to define conform satellites, even though you haven't yet found any source systems. Task 3, find source systems, create their source-specific satellites, map them to business hubs, business links, and use business rules to fill in the gaps. If I say it fast, sounds easy. Notes: beware source system data vault. Now, Hans often talks about ensemble modelling, and I appreciate the contribution Hans has made to the industry. So I don't know, Hans, if you're on this call, welcome, thanks for joining us. But just a point that, and please, this is not a criticism of Hans at all. What I'm saying is that the way Hans' ensemble modelling has been used, my observations is that they are often logical data vault models, not necessarily enterprise conceptual models. Please, 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 I'm not being critical of ensemble modelling, or there's fact-based modelling. There's a number of modelling approaches. Please don't confuse the modelling technique with what you are modelling. Are you modelling the business, or are you modelling a data vault? Anchor modelling is another good example. So in closing, there's a web page. I've got a downloadable document that has a lightweight set of data models, those 9 pillars. I've got a sample enterprise data model, call it Ontology if you like. If you go to TDAN, the Data Administrator newsletter, and just do a search for top-down, you'll find some articles there which are another take on what I've just spoken about. Data Vault reference books, you know the books. Linstead and Olschimp, if that's how I pronounce Michael's name. The Data Vault 2 book, Hans has a book on modelling. The Data Model Patterns, David Hay, Len Silverstone. I've got a book on doing agile, fast and good data models. A lot of what I've been speaking about today comes from the book, the more recent book, The Elephant in the Fridge, that is aimed at Data Vault. Been talking fast, and it's 11 o'clock my time. Sorry, time zone differences here. So Neil, that's a run through the slide pack. There's a lot of material. I won't be surprised if there's questions, and I think Neil is encouraging us to stay away.
Yeah, if you could just release